Okay, so a lot happened with embryonic development in the first 4 weeks. We had gastrulation, neurulation, morphogenesis. We had the development of the 3 extra embryonic germ layers, as well as the three primary germ layers and the 3 extra embryonic membranes. So we're now going to continue on from there and look at the rest of embryonic development, which is week 5 to 8, so the second month of pregnancy. So we're going to look at the different structures that will develop over the course of this month. We'll talk about the development of different sex characteristics. We'll talk about how the umbilical cord and extra embryonic membranes continue to develop. We'll talk about the placenta developing, and we'll also talk about the difference between an embryo and a fetus. So in week 5, the spinal cord has swollen at one end to form an actual distinct brain area where the head of the embryo is, which will cause the head of the embryo to grow and kind of swell. The brain cells will also start to differentiate really, really quickly. So the brain is developing very rapidly at this point. The eyes will have developed even more, though there will be no eyelids. And then the nose and lips are also starting to form at this point. In week 6, again, the brain is going to keep on growing. The limbs will lengthen from those little tiny buds that we saw in the previous slideshow. The gonads will also start to produce hormones. So just a reminder, gonads are the ovaries and testes. So those are going to start secreting hormones like testosterone from the testes and estrogen from the ovaries, which will influence the development of the external genitalia. Sex is determined based on chromosomes. So the SRY is the sex determining region of the Y chromosome. And it is that sex determining region of the Y chromosome that essentially codes for maleness in the DNA. If a person's DNA has that sex determining region on the Y chromosome, the gonads will develop into testes and produce testosterone. If that sex determining region is not there, then the gonads will develop into ovaries instead. If testosterone is the hormone that's being produced, it will cause the development of the external male sex characteristics later on when the fetus is developing. If there is no Y chromosome, so instead there are 2 X's, then the gonads turn into ovaries, and they're going to cause the production of female sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which will, again, later on in fetal development, promote the development of the external female sex characteristics. Both males and females have both male and female sex hormones. So men also have estrogen, women also have testosterone. It's just in different amounts. So women will have very low levels of testosterone, high levels of estrogen. It will be the opposite in males. Sometimes those ratios aren't where they should be during fetal development, so it can result in the genetics of a fetus being different than the sex characteristics that develop. So for instance, like someone who is XY and yet develops ovaries instead of testes. It could also cause the development of intersex individuals where they have a combination of both male and female sex characteristics. So for instance, they might develop a penis but also have ovaries. In week 7 and 8, you have a bunch of different organs in the body forming. The nervous system starts actually coordinating some of the activity that's happening in the body. A skeleton will form. At this point, it will not be a bone skeleton, it will be a cartilage skeleton instead. But you do have that skeleton starting to form. Hands and feet will start appearing on the ends of those little limbs that have formed. The eyes are developing even more. Nostrils will form, though they won't function. They will be plugged with mucus at that point. External genitalia starts developing, so that's like the penis and vagina. though it will not actually differentiate into a penis or a vagina at this point. It's just kind of very, very early on developing those sex characteristics. The yolk sac will shrink. It's starting to produce fewer red blood cells at this point. The amniotic sac is going to enlarge in order to make more room for a growing embryo and then fetus. And the umbilical cord will start to function more and more at this point. The blood vessels of the umbilical cord are forming from the extra embryonic membrane called the allantois. That umbilical cord is then going to connect from the embryo/fetus to the placenta. That it connects to the embryo and fetus at the belly button or the navel region once it's done developing. It is going to contain 2 arteries to move deoxygenated blood from the placenta into the fetus, and then 1 vein as well, okay, to move oxygenated blood. Some of the allantois that's not used for the umbilical cord will degenerate and form part of the bladder. Okay, so this is kind of what this would look like at this point. So the chorion goes around the outside in pink, and you have the chorionic villi, which is burrowing into the uterine wall and will form the placenta. You've got the yolk sac, which is this yellow thing here, which is forming the red blood cells and shrinking at this point. You've got this whole section here, which is forming the umbilical cord, which will connect to the placenta when it's more developed. You have the amnion, which is this light blue layer, which surrounds the amniotic fluid. You've got the embryo inside here. The head is enlarging because of the developing brain. The embryo and then fetus will just float around inside this amniotic fluid. Okay, the chorion is going to develop into the placenta. It's going to essentially form that chorionic villi, burrow into the endometrium, and then all of that chorionic villi will work with the endometrium to form the placenta. So the placenta is forming at this point. It will not be fully formed until week 10. The placenta is a big disc-shaped organ. It is very, very vascularized, which just means it is full of blood vessels. It is where nutrients, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, waste products, all of that kind of stuff are exchanged between mother and embryo or fetus later on. It is important to note that there is no mixing of the mother and fetal blood. Gases or nutrients just diffuse from the mother's blood into the developing baby's blood. Okay, there's no actual contact between the 2 blood. They're just side by side, and materials can diffuse from one to the other. The placenta will also be producing the HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which is going to maintain the corpus luteum, which makes the progesterone in order to maintain the endometrium. The placenta will eventually stop producing HCG and just directly produce progesterone, but that doesn't happen until about month 4. So this is just a bunch of different things that the placenta does. So it's going to move nutrients from the mother to the baby, so things like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, all that kind of stuff. It's also going to move waste products from the baby to the mother, so urea and ammonia, all of that kind of stuff that would form urine in a full-grown adult has to be moved from the baby to the mother so that she can combine it with her urine. It also moves things like oxygen and carbon dioxide between mother and baby, so moving oxygen to the baby, moving carbon dioxide from the baby. It helps with hormone secretion, which we talked about, so it's going to start by secreting HCG. Later on, we'll switch to progesterone and a bit of estrogen. And it also helps with creating the baby's immune system because the mother's antibodies can diffuse from her through the placenta to the baby. Okay, so just differentiating between an embryo and a fetus here, week 1 to 8 is an embryo. Everything after week 8 is considered a fetus. At the end of week 8, about 90% of the organs and structures have started developing, but they still have a long way to go to be fully developed. At this point, a lot of different harmful substances, which we're actually going to talk about later on, but things like alcohol, cigarettes, different drugs, toxins in the environment, radiation, all of those are really, really harmful, especially at this early point, because you have so much brain development and because so many of the organs and systems are starting their development at this point. Okay, and then twins is kind of a unique situation. There's a couple different ways that you can have twins develop. If a zygote, so a fertilized egg, separates into 2 separate cell clusters, that's going to result in identical twins because both of those cell clusters were made from the same egg and same sperm and therefore have the exact same DNA. If the blastocyst divides really late, it can result in a shared embryonic cavity, which can be dangerous because the umbilical cords of the 2 fetuses can intertwine and become tangled. But usually the division of that zygote happens earlier on. And then there's also the second option to develop twins, which is that there are 2 separate eggs released during ovulation. Each of those 2 eggs becomes fertilized and both implant. And in that case, you'll end up with fraternal twins, which are twins that are, you know, gestated at the same time, born at the same time, but not genetically identical to each other because their DNA is made of separate eggs and separate sperm. Okay, so we're just going to continue from that and jump right into the fetal development now, which again is anything after week 8. So we're going to be looking at all the different ways that the fetus is going to develop in the remaining weeks of pregnancy. We're going to look at what's happening in the 2nd and 3rd trimester, and also look at the different hormones that are necessary for all of this to happen. So fetal development does begin at week 9. Again, it's an embryo up until the end of week 8. Organs are mostly all present at this point, but do still need to develop quite a bit, and the fetus still has to grow quite a bit. So at week 9, the arms and legs will start to move. You can see sucking reflex where, like if you have like a ultrasound, you can see the baby like sucking on its thumb. There will be a lot of growth in the length of the body at this time. The head isn't going to grow quite as quickly at this point. The body's going to start looking a bit more proportional to the head. And the cartilage skeleton that had developed is going to start to harden into bone. Week 10, we then have the placenta fully developed from the chorion. Nothing much really happens in week 11. Week 12 is when the external male and female genitalia actually differentiate. So we start to be able to identify differences between like a penis and a vagina. We can start seeing the penis form, that sort of thing. And then we get into the 2nd trimester. So the 2nd trimester is week 13 or about month 4, and will continue on until the end of month 6. So month 4, 5, and 6 are all the 2nd trimester. The fetus will go from being about 8 centimeters long at the beginning of this. All of the organs, again, are formed but not developed. If the baby were born at the end of the 2nd trimester, there is a small chance of survival, though it would be very difficult because the organs, especially the respiratory organs, would not be fully formed at that point. But yeah, by this kind of end of the first trimester, start of the second, we have our little fetus fully formed, or formed this much. Yeah, this is kind of end of first trimester sized fetus. So in month 4, you can start seeing irregular breath movements from the fetus. The heartbeat becomes loud enough that you can hear it with a stethoscope. The legs are going to develop. There's going to be starting, the mother will start being able to feel movement. You won't actually be able to feel it like from the outside, like with a hand on the belly at this point, but the mother will be able to feel like fluttering and stuff like that. That is the movement of the fetus. And the placenta is going to take over the production of estrogen and progesterone. So at this point, the placenta stops making the HCG, which means that the corpus luteum in the ovary is no longer stimulated. So the corpus luteum stops producing progesterone, it degenerates into the corpus albicans, and instead the placenta is just going to directly start pumping out progesterone to once again maintain that endometrium of the uterus. Month 5 is a gross one. Fine hair and an oily substance covers the entire body of the fetus. By this point, joints begin to form as most of the skeleton is now bone, and the body again starts to become more proportional to the size of the head. So the body is going to enlarge compared to the head. And you'll also start to see the fetus actually maintain or get into the fetal position where it's kind of like curled over. Month 6, the skin is going to be really kind of wrinkly and saggy on the fetus because there's not going to be very much fat on the fetus to kind of plump it up. The skin is also going to become very pink as capillaries start to extend into it. Prior to that, it's kind of like a sickly pale color. The eyelashes are also going to form on the eyes. And then by the end of this month, the fetus is about 34 centimeters long, so a little bit longer than a ruler. Then we get into the third trimester, which is months 7, 8, and 9. At this point, the baby's growth is really, really rapid. The organs are going to enlarge and start to develop more. Nutrition is super important in this trimester because the baby's growing so quickly. And if the mother's nutrition isn't good enough, it will cause damage to the placenta, which will mean that the baby's not getting as much oxygen and nutrients as it needs. By the end of this trimester, the average baby is about 51 centimeters long, so about half of a meter thick, and about 3,400 grams. So in month 7, you still have a lot of brain cells forming. You'll realize that through almost the entirety of embryonic and fetal development, we have a lot of brain cells forming. Brain growth is super important throughout most of pregnancy. But at this point, you have really intricate neural networks forming. Bone marrow is also going to form inside the bones and take over the production of red blood cells. So at this point, the yolk sac is no longer needed. It'll degenerate and the bone marrow will produce the red blood cells instead. In males, the testes will descend out of the abdominal cavity into the scrotum at this point, and the fetus tends to shift upside down. Month 8, you finally have fat developing underneath the baby's skin, which will cause it to become less wrinkly and more plump. And the digestive system and respiratory system are going to continue to mature. The respiratory system is one of the last ones to develop, which is why premature babies often have to be on ventilators and stuff like that. Month 9, that fine hair that covered the baby's body is finally shed. Fingernails will form. By the end of this month, the baby and placenta will be about the same size, which I found shocking when I first learned about this. I did not realize the placenta was that big, but placenta is very large. The fetus will also stop moving around as much because there's just not enough space inside the mother anymore. And then by the end of month 9, the fetus will be fully mature and ready for birth. Again, hormones are really important for this entire process. Pretty much right away after fertilization, as soon as that implantation of the blastocyst happens, the HCG is being produced. That is needed for the corpus luteum to stop from degenerating, to maintain that corpus luteum. If that corpus luteum isn't there, the endometrium gets shed along with the blastocyst. So the corpus luteum needs to be maintained so that it is secreting the progesterone that's needed to maintain the endometrium. That corpus luteum will keep making progesterone. At week 10, the placenta is mostly developed and will take over a lot of the progesterone production and will stop producing the HCG, so the corpus luteum can degenerate at that point. Around week 15, there's another hormone that we haven't talked much about called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that causes uterine contractions. It comes from the posterior pituitary. And those oxytocin levels will just gradually increase throughout pregnancy from 15 weeks on until right at the process of like labor, and then it really spikes. So this chart just kind of shows how different hormone levels change over time. So obviously we have this big increase in HCG right after, like shortly after fertilization when implantation happens. That HCG will make sure that we're getting lots of progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum inside the ovary. So that's what this early section is talking about here, is progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum in the ovary. Once the placenta forms at, again, about week 10, that is when the placenta is going to take over production of progesterone and estrogen and stop secreting the HCG. So the HCG level is going to drop off as we come up to week 10 here, which then, as the corpus luteum degenerates, is going to cause a drop off in the progesterone and estrogen. But while that drop off is happening, we have a buildup of progesterone and estrogen that's coming from the placenta directly. And then at week 15, we slowly have this buildup of oxytocin until right when labor happens and you have this big spike of oxytocin here. You might also be able to make out that at that same time, right kind of when labor is happening, you'll have a big spike in the amount of estrogen and a big drop off in the amount of progesterone. And we're going to talk later about why that happens. So that's it for this lesson. We're going to come back to this chart in the next lesson, but I will see you there.